It's Women on Wednesday on The Dana Barrett Show.
Hey, in the spirit of women promoting other women and women in particular in my field, women talkers promoting other women talkers, I need to welcome a lifelong female advocate for women to the world of talking, Ambassador Melanne Verveer, who is the executive director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, among other titles. She's an author and, like I said, really a lifelong advocate for women, has now launched a podcast. So welcome to our show and welcome to the world of talking, Melanne.
Well, thank you so much, Dana. It's a pleasure to be with you, and we're just on the threshold of International Women's Day and celebrating Women's History Month, so it's a good time to talk.
Yeah, and the last time you and I spoke on my show was actually all the way back in 2015 when your book came out. And so I know it's been important to you for a long time to get some of these messages out to women. The new podcast, I believe, is called Seeking Peace, correct?
It is. Thank you for asking.
And the book,
it really does highlight the work of so many women, more prominent women than those we don't know about or know so little about, but people like Ashley Judd and the former presidents of Liberia and Ireland, the first major general who's heading up a UN peacekeeping mission. These are important roles, and our whole goal is that more and more people understand the extraordinary role that women are playing across our world, because it matters greatly. It matters for us in our everyday lives, and it matters for the kind of world we all want to see.
Well, talk to me a little bit, Melanne, about not just sort of the subjects of the podcast, which I do want to get into a little bit, but also sort of what the goal is. What are you hoping to accomplish in getting some of these messages out?
Well, we're really hoping to create more public understanding, awareness, interest in. We don't know often as much as we are besieged by so many sources of information today. Some of it is not really of the nature that focuses on not only the leadership of women, but the podcast also includes reports from the field, what's happening in terms of women in policing in Afghanistan, or what's happening with the role that women are playing in Colombia in terms of trying to move their country forward. So real-life stories from the field brought to us by top-notch journalists, as well as interviews with very prominent people who have played a significant role.
So talk to me now a little bit about sort of how because you do have an incredible, I'm looking at the website, there's about a half a dozen episodes already out, and you've got just an incredible lineup, but they're very different women. So how are you sort of choosing who you want to speak to?
Well, they've all played a role in peace work, either working on the ground or illuminating women's rights issues. But that one strain that they all have in common is work that they've done at home around the world in their own countries to really advance human rights, women's rights, and the role of women in peacemaking. And one of the things I think we're not aware of is we are aware of many conflicts in our world today, but we may not be aware of the fact that most peace agreements, at least half of them, fail after the first 5 years that they come into enactment, once they're enacted and going forward. And one of the reasons is that women are often not at the table. They are not negotiators, mediators. They are not bringing the experience that they've had in their own conflict-affected country to the table, so that the very questions that need to be answered so the lives going forward can be better and the peace can be sustainable and kept actually get ironed out. And we've seen where it has happened, for example, issues about crossing the community divides, healing some of those divisions, issues having to do with economic opportunity, issues having to do with the very kinds of specifics that have often made some of these tensions come into being, can more readily be addressed, reconciliation issues. So it's critically important, and it's one of the reasons that we are doing the work we're doing at Georgetown University to really understand the role that women play in peace and security, why it's important for prevention, why it's important in negotiations, why it's important after a conflict ends, that they be fully engaged in rebuilding their countries in terms of institutions, in terms of moving the economy forward, et cetera. We have so much data today that we're not really taking advantage of, and so we're putting a spotlight on all of that, as well as trying to work with decision makers around the world so that we can do a better job collectively to make our world a better place.
Absolutely. Ambassador Melanne Verveer on the phone with us right now, Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security at Georgetown University and host of the Seeking Peace podcast that organization has put out, an incredible podcast. Before we run out of time, Melanne, I have to ask you, since you're talking sort of about these, conflict countries where there's been conflict and having women involved in sort of rebuilding, when the cultures just haven't been that way for so long, where women just haven't had even close to what looks like equal rights in those countries, how do you sort of get them to be a part of the process and sort of have society even accept that?
Well, often they're not at the peace table, as I said, but very often because they're so active in their communities. They're more active than I think most people at the top know. They're the ones who are actually contributing to keeping the countries going in many ways on a day-in, day-out basis. It's having others reach out to them, mediators, for example, others in civil society, so that civil society can understand how they can take what their own experiences are and have that impact the decision makers. You know, in a place like Colombia, for example, that just has had 50 years of conflict, it's gone through an extraordinary struggle. There was a very, very active process to bring women into that process because women bore the brunt, as they do in many of these conflicts. But they're not only those who are affected, they are the agents of change, and we have to listen and address what has impacted them as well as what they understand has to happen going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, one last thing, bringing it back to the U.S. for a moment. In the 2018 election, we now see many, many more women in Congress than ever before and in roles in their states. Do you feel like that's going to help at all with the peace issue around the world?
Well, I think it always helps because women tend, whether in our country or in other countries, to put issues on the table that may not get there otherwise. Women have played a very prominent role in the United States, even with our fewer numbers compared to other countries, on bringing a lot of attention to issues like violence against women, like women's health care needs, women in foreign policy. We did an event last night on Capitol Hill honoring some of the members of Congress who have been particularly strong leaders in ensuring that our foreign policy considers the role of women across the board in how we carry it out, whether it's through our development agencies, our diplomacy, or even in our military affairs, because it will make us more effective and it will make a stronger difference in the long run.
Well, I have to tell you, Melanne, it's a great podcast, and thank you so much for the incredible work. The podcast, again, is called Seeking Peace. It's hosted by Ambassador Melanne Verveer, and we will post a link to it on our show notes page at Dana Barrett.